Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the panel on collaboration strategies for digital Black Books projects. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History at the American Antiquarian Society, and I'm delighted to serve as moderator for today's panel. Recent years have seen an exciting convergence between work on Black authored texts from 19th century and digital projects in the 21st century. Such projects go beyond expanding the canon to consider the very idea of books expansively, encompassing a wide variety of Black authored texts, including newspapers, speeches, minutes from colored conventions, and self-published pamphlets that mix history with song. Taking advantage of the affordances of the digital, these projects showcased today move beyond recovery work to embrace interactive engagement. They model collaborative scholarship between scholars, library workers, undergraduate and graduate students, and community members, using strategies like crowdsourcing transcriptions or lesson plans for creative classroom projects. Today's panel will consist of three parts. First, each panelist today will have a few moments to introduce their respective works. Second, we will hold an informal conversation around these works in which shared successful strategies, uh, discuss funding challenges, and brainstorm new approaches. Finally, at the end, there will be time at the end of the panel for you to submit questions to our panelists. And you may do so using the function at the bottom of your screen called Q&A. Before we begin, I would like to introduce today's panelists together in the order in which they appear. First, Shirley Moody Turner is Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at Penn State University. She's a founding co-director with Gabrielle Foreman of the Center for Black Digital Research and the soon-to-launch Black Women's Organizing Archive. Her work focuses on recuperating often buried forms of 19th and early 20th century Black women's intellectual, literary, and social activism. She's the author or editor of 4 books: Black Folklore and the Politics of Racial Representation, Contemporary African American Literature, the Living Canon, African American Literature in Transition, 1900 to 1910, and the forthcoming Penguin Portable Anna Julia Cooper. She's currently at work on a biography of Anna Julia Cooper. Second, we have Curtis Small. Curtis Small is a librarian and coordinator of public services for the Special Collections Department at the University of Delaware Library, Museums, and Press. In this position, he coordinates the reference, instruction, and exhibition programs, and also serves as a curator for the rare books collections. In 2017, Curtis curated the exhibition Issues and Debates in African American Literature at the UD Library. In 2019, he was an organizer for the Black Bibliographia Conference, also at the University of Delaware. As a proud team member of the Colored Conventions Project, Curtis works on permissions and outreach. He has also done scholarly research on the print history of the Colored Conventions movement and the importance of Haiti within that movement. Curtis also works to increase racial diversity among professionals in the fields of archives and special collections. He holds a PhD in French from New York University and an MLIS degree from the School of Library and Information Science at Simmons University. Third, we have Kristen Mariah. She's an assistant professor of English at Queen's University and a partner with the Penn State Center for Black Digital Research. Her research interests include sound studies and Black feminist performance. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada, the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, and the Harry Ransom Center. Next, we have Bridget Fielder. Bridget is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is, with Jonathan Senshin, co-editor of Against a Sharp White Background, Infrastructures of African American Print from the University of Wisconsin Press 2019, and author of Relative Races, Genealogies of Interracial Kinship in 19th Century from Duke University Press this past year. She's currently writing a second book on racialized human-animal relationships in the long 19th century, which shows how childhood becomes a key site for humanization and racialization. And finally, we have Elizabeth Watts Pope. Elizabeth is curator of books and digitized collections at the American Antiquarian Society. She works to connect people to their history by providing access to printed and digitized sources, especially focusing on underdocumented groups. Elizabeth has presented widely on early American subjects, including Black self-publishing, Hawaiian printing, and women's commonplace books. She holds an MA in history from the University of Connecticut. And at this time, I would now like to begin our introductions to these projects, starting with Shirley Moody Turner. And I will be turning on the PowerPoint as well in just a second.
Great, thank you so much. I want to first just say a quick thank you to the conference organizers, to Elizabeth and Kevin for coordinating this session, and to my fellow panelists and to everybody who is joining us here today to talk about strategies for collaborative Black book projects. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Shirley Moody Turner, and I co-direct with Gabrielle Foreman, the Center for Black Digital Research, which we fondly call Dig Black, and which launched at Penn State University in May 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic. Today, I'm going to provide just a quick overview of the center and some of its key projects, but I'm also going to, in this short time that I have to introduce it, try to give a sense of who we are and how we do our work at the center. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Kristen Mariah and Curtis Smalls, who will share more about their work as models for how our collaborations have been really foundational in building and growing the center projects. So the Center for Black Digital Research is committed to bringing the buried and scattered histories of early Black organizing to digital life. The center works through collaborative partnerships to carry out its archive and pipeline building missions, both to preserve Black organizing histories in the long 19th century and to help build future generations of intellectuals who advocate for Black dignity, rights, and social justice in higher education, repositories, museums, and beyond. We devote a good deal of our time to the intensive labor that it takes to enact transformative change and to build a collaborative, principle-driven community for those with whom we work. Slide, please. So the center is home to 3 major projects. The long-standing and award-winning Color Conventions Project, which was founded at the University of Delaware by Gabrielle Foreman and Jim Casey. The Color Conventions Project brings 7 decades of 19th century Black organizing to digital life. Douglas Day, co-directed by Jim Casey and Denise Berger, which celebrates Frederick Douglass's birthday with a global transcribathon to share and preserve Black records. And the newly launched Black Women's Organizing Archive that brings together the scattered archives and buried histories of 19th and early 20th century Black women organizers, intellectuals, and activists. Next slide. Our team includes about 30 to 35 members, from undergraduate researchers to graduate student team leaders to faculty partners, librarians, archivists, IT specialists, and community partners who come together with shared and overlapping commitments to preserving and expanding access to the histories of Black organizing. Slide. And that's us at one of our Zoom meetings, how many of us met during this year in which we launched virtually. And one of our projects, our newest project, actually, the Black Women's Organizing Archive, is committed to moving Black women's activism in the long 19th century unapologetically to the forefront of our recovery efforts, and is devoting its first several years to bringing together the archives of key figures in the history of Black organizing and activism. So we feature figures like Anna Julia Cooper, Marianne Shagg Carey, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Church Terrell, and potentially organizations like the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And I wanted to just take a couple of my last 2 minutes or so to say a little bit more about the Black Women's Organizing Archive, just as a model for one of the projects of the center, and a project that has really had the benefit of learning a lot and working in collaboration with both CCP and Douglas Day. So this slide here just gives an example of how the Black Women's Organizing Archive works and how it's proposing to work. So some of this is being done, some is in process, and some is in aspiration. But you can see that, you know, the Black Women's Organizing Archive works to locate papers that are sometimes scattered across different archives, to build the relationships necessary to bring those papers together, and then to digitize those papers and create digital collections of these women activists' work. And then also always thinking about how do we involve and engage different publics in the knowledge production and creation that it takes both to build those collections and then to use those collections in ways that really disrupt and intervene and shape and shift public and scholarly knowledge. So that slide just gives a kind of sense of how that BWOA is imagining carrying that work out. And so in the next slide, you can see that this gives you just an example of like, well, what does that actually look like in practice? And so in practice, I wanted to share this example because it takes us through several steps of that process. So the first slide, the text on the Black background, has a list of where Anna Julia Cooper's collections, both print and digital, reside around the country. And then in the top slide, you see the four individuals. Those four individuals, McKinney Johnson, Lopez Matthews, me, and Adrena Eifel, came together working with the Moreland Spingarn Research Center to digitize the Anna Julia Cooper papers that were held at the Moreland Spingarn Center. So that was the group that came together and worked on that collaboration. And then the image under that is the actual digital collection as it is now live at the Digital Howard website. So we worked together, digitized the collection. It's available at Howard. And then we had a symposium where we started our work and our partnership with CCP and Douglas Day to launch the collection to the broader community. And then in the next slide, you can see that in 2020, we partnered with the Douglas Day team led by Jim Casey and Denise Berger and hosted an international transcribe-a-thon of the digitized documents from the Digital Cooper collection. And in just a matter of a couple of weeks, we were able to get 100% of the documents in that project transcribed. But we worked with teams of students. We worked with the Zooniverse platform to create the manifest, to create the transcription project, and then to launch that in a way that would bring, you know, thousands of people from around the country, and also really importantly, local people who were invested and have been invested for years in Cooper's work, writing, and legacy, and bring them all together to work on this project and to work in creating the knowledge that helped to shape and shift both the scholarly and public knowledge around Cooper. And so that just gives a sense of both what we're imagining the project, but then what it also actually looks like when it's peopled, you know, and not just a kind of chart. But in the next slide, which I'm not going to show, I'm not going to show now, but if you get, no, you can show the next slide. The next slide has a video, which I'm not going to show. But if you do get a chance to take a look at it, it's a really, I think in some ways, a better representation than anything I can relate here of what the Black Women's Organizing Archive projects in their most ideal manifestations might actually look like. And just to see, you know, what did it mean to bring people together? What does it mean to do this work in community? What does it mean to shape and change the way we're thinking about digital collections, editions, and projects? And so that's an example. If anyone wants to go separately and take a look at that, that'd be great. And then finally, I'm just going to close by saying that I am, you know, just giving a quick overview of kind of one snippet of the work that we do. And I'm really thrilled to have two of my colleagues here, Kristen Mariah and Curtis Small, to talk about the amazing work that they're doing and how these partnerships really foreground the ways in which the collaborations with the Center for Black Digital Research work. So thank you so much, and I look forward to being able to have more conversation during the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. I would now like to introduce Curtis Small, who will be introducing his part of colored conventions. Curtis.
Hi. I assume that everybody can hear me, right, Kevin?
I can hear you. You're in good shape.
Thank you. So I am going to go quickly. We already had an introduction to the Center for Dig Black, but I'm going to talk about the Color Conventions Project, the Color Conventions movement that I've been most closely associated with over the past years. Okay, and I'm going to begin by quickly underlining the importance of the Color Conventions movement. Next slide. Kevin, could you give me the next slide? Yeah, I'd like to quickly underline the importance of the Color Conventions movement for the historical study of Black print culture and publishing at its roots. Records from the first Color Convention, held in 1830 in Philadelphia, figure in Dorothy Porter Wesley's very influential 1945 checklist and later annotated bibliography of early Negro writing. I'd like to point this out to say that the corpus of documents that sit at the root of Black bibliography and Black studies in the United States included documents from the Colored Conventions movement. Despite this, the movement has long been under-researched for reasons that I will get into shortly. Next slide, please. Now, I'll briefly characterize the Color Conventions movement itself. From 1830 until the end of the 19th century, Black Americans all over the country organized and met in national, state, and local conventions that broadened the horizons of American democracy. Convention delegates drafted petitions demanding equal treatment in the areas of voting rights, education, and labor. They debated and voted on measures to combat slavery while slavery was still in effect. They were the first to compile statistics regarding Black occupations, property ownership, and institutional affiliation. They published statements that pled their cause to the broader, read white, American public. They debated essential questions, such as whether Blacks would ever receive justice in this country or whether they should emigrate. Schools, newspapers, and at least one college arose from the activities of the convention movement. Now, this movement was not characterized by a central organization that maintained records in one place. Proceedings from conventions were often published and circulated in the regions where the meetings took place, but not beyond. At the end of the 19th century, as the movement was winding down, the print record of the most important Black-led political movement of the century, the Colored Conventions movement, constituted a scattered archive. This situation has been changing since 2012, when the students and faculty of a graduate course at University of Delaware launched the Colored Conventions Project, or CCP, a digital space that brings together the largest body of minutes and other documents ever assembled from the Colored Conventions movement of the 19th century. Since the inception, a team of graduate and undergraduate students, librarians, and faculty members have built coloredconventions.org into an award-winning public humanities site. Next slide, please. This slide, I'm not going to linger here, it gives a sense of some of the components of this. There's a lot more to say about all of this. The site was redesigned not long before the COVID shutdown, and that process continued into the shutdown. I can talk more about that later. Next slide, please. I do want to point out, though, an important part of the genesis of the Colored Conventions Project, which preceded Dig Black and BWOA. Naturally, part of the missions of CCP was to render visible the contributions of African Americans to their own survival and to American democracy. The importance of the colored conventions movement has been obscured for reasons I just invoked about the archival scattered archive, but also institutional and historical racism. However, the role of Black women in the movement is often obscured by the convention proceedings themselves, which emphasize men's words and actions. Due to what I'll euphemistically call gendered social practices of the day, women were a small percentage of the delegates, and it was exceptional for women to address the convention directly, although this did happen. However, we know that women played a much more important role in the convention than is often immediately evident in the printed proceedings. The Colored Conventions Project counteracts this particular type of erasure by means of a type of research represented in the scholarly exhibitions that you see here on this page. These are icons from some of the exhibitions that highlight the work of women and the role of women. We also counteract erasure through the decisions that are made regarding the web interfaces and metadata schemes underlying coloredconventions.org, and by the guidelines we share for the use of data coming from coloredconventions.org. Later during our conversation, I will give specific examples of the types of practices I'm talking about here. One final slide that I will not talk about. Next slide, please. The recently published collection of essays about the Colored Conventions movement was enabled by coloredconventions.org and will carry historical research around the movement further. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Curtis. And I'd now like to invite Kristen Mariah.
Thank you, Kevin. And I would also like to thank the organizers and also my collaborators at the Center for Black Digital Research for inviting me to talk about this aspect of my work with them. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk, I think, very casually and hopefully very briefly about some of my work around Mary Ann Chad Carey, and then hopefully, if there are additional questions, we'll have time to chat during the Q&A. But I'll say that this project began in fall 2018 when I was a new CCP teaching fellow and when I was undertaking research for an article that was recently published in a Canadian theatre journal. And I visited Archives Ontario to take a look at their Mary Ann Chad Carey fawns. It's a collection of letters to and from abolitionist Mary Ann Chad Carey, and roughly between, the letters date roughly between 1851 to 1863, the years that she lived in Canada West. The fawns weren't something I had previously accessed or considered as part of my research, but I was at that time working on an article, and I was hoping that I would find something that perhaps linked Mary Ann Chad Carey to the performer that I was also writing about at the time, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield. So I had hopes of coming across something like a concert program or something of that sort. Next slide. What I didn't realize at the time is that while attempting to work with the fawns, I became sort of drawn into the backstory behind the collection. And it's a story retold by documentarian Alison Margot Smith in her short documentary, Mary Ann Chad Revisited, Echoes from an Old House. Again, that's a documentary that I can put a link to later in the chat, but I invite you to look at it. And it really explains some of the ways in which the materials were eventually sort of partially loaned to Archives Ontario, and how that collection came to be one of the first examples of early Black Canadian manuscripts, right, that were contained in that at that archives. And so to make a long story short, I'll just say that the letters were actually left in Mary Ann Chad Carey's house near Chatham, Ontario, when she returned to the USA to help with the Civil War effort. And they were actually forgotten. They were left up in the attic of the house. And so the house itself remained in the hands of various members of the Shad family for generations. And they were accidentally rediscovered in 1974 by the Robbins family. And they had part of the house torn down, and they were in the process of getting rid of the rubble, and realized that there were sort of papers scattered in the rubble. They took a look at it, and they realized that they were actually old letters, and they connected the old letters that they found in the debris of the house to Mary Ann Chud Carey. So in fact, we were very close to losing actually all of those materials. Next slide, please. So the Robbins family at that time in 1974 actually lent the papers to Archives Ontario. And at that point, they were photographed and put onto microfilm. And that's pretty much the state in which they remained available to most researchers up until today. Next slide. Of course, the problem with microfilm is that the images aren't always of a very high quality. And so this is one of the images from that FONS. When I was sitting in Archives Ontario doing my own research, I found it very difficult to determine exactly what the document said. And of course, some of that's due to the fact that they were partially damaged and in poor condition. But I think that some of that poor visual quality is also due to the technology used to capture the images in the first place. And so I began asking questions about the papers, and I was actually able to contact the owners. And so they had retained ownership of the papers, even though at one point they had lent the papers to Archives Ontario. And so next slide. So eventually, along with the Center for Black Digital Research, the work that we've been doing resulted in a meeting between the owners of papers, the Robbins family, and senior archivists at Archives Ontario. And that meeting took place in March. And at that meeting, we brought together various stakeholders to discuss the upcoming 200th anniversary of Mary Ann Chud Carey's birth. And the possibility of, for the first time ever really, digitizing Archives Ontario's collection of Mary Ann Chud Carey's papers and making them publicly accessible alongside other materials that have already been digitized. And so we also brought in folks from the Moreland Spingarn Research Center, and we brought in other people who have been active in Black history in the Chatham community, specifically the people who run the Buxton National Historic Site and Museum. And we were hoping to create a sort of sense of cohesion and momentum right around the 2023 Douglas Day Transcribe-a-thon. So the kinds of projects that Shirley was explaining in terms of Mary Church Terrell are hopefully projects that we'll be able to undertake with Mary Ann Chud Carey's FONS now that the owners of the paper and Archives Ontario have come to an agreement about digitizing the papers and actually housing them permanently at Archives Ontario. We hope that a public transcription project will renew critical attention around Mary Ann Chud Carey and perhaps shed light on hidden aspects of her life and politics. I'm still hoping that we come across some kind of nugget that talks about, in which Mary Ann Chud Carey talks explicitly about her connection to maybe other Black women performers, but even outside of that, right? I think that there's so much that we can learn through having access to these papers, really for the first time on a wide scale. And so that is the end of my presentation for now, but I'd be happy to answer more questions about our work with the papers during the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. And next we have Bridget Fielder.
Hello, can everybody hear me all right?
You're in good shape, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. I'm very interested in mostly learning a lot from my co-presenters here today. My title slide acknowledges the array of scholars who have been central to the Just Teach One early African American print project, which includes a list of past conveners. The founding project conveners were Nicole Aljo, Lois Brown, John Ernest, P. Gabrielle Foreman, Eric Gardner, and Joycelyn Moody. And I'm here today simply as a representative of the current collective of conveners, which also includes Alex Black, Britt Russert, Tara Bynum, Cassandra Smith, and Derek Spires. I've taken on a bit of a coordinating role among us, which means I send the emails and schedule the Zoom meetings. And I joined the team of conveners in 2017. And now our current team is entirely comprised of scholars who are not original to the project. I want to talk just a little bit about the history of this project and its content and current state, which might reveal a bit about digital projects that are in early or transitional stages, and think a little bit about the projections that we've been talking about for future endeavors. Next slide, please. The project was conceived as a loose spinoff from the innovative Early American Just Teach One initiative that was founded by Duncan Faraday and Ed White, and supported also by the American Antiquarian Society, in order to highlight early African American literature. The poll quote that I've highlighted here comes from the project's original announcement that was circulated in 2014. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this for you. The recovery of African American literature, and so a full sense of American literature, is far from over. But while teachers and scholars have rich range of anthologies, editions, and other resources than ever before, changing an academic landscape reified by decades of neglect, dismissal, and other forms of racism, large and small, will continue to take thoughtful and concerted efforts and significant new learning by all involved. And so the impetus of this project is like its sister project, Just Teach One, Early American print, is to create a series of texts that would be available to instructors who want to just teach one newly recovered non-canonical text in their existing courses, and provide some of the resources for doing that. And so I'll talk a little bit just about what the core components of these editions include. Next slide, please. Primarily, these include a transcription of the text accompanied by a scholarly introduction. And here you see the introduction to Teresa, A Haitian Tale, which was first published in Freedom's Journal, the first known African-American newspaper, in 1827. These introductions included TEI encoding and were accompanied by some other materials. One of this is a list of suggested further reading. And so on the right, you see very tiny, I just wanted to show its scope and scale, a list of suggested reading for to go with the Weekly Anglo-African and Pine and Palm selections from 1861 to 1862. These editions accompany, these materials accompany and serve to frame the text for readers who include students and also instructors who may not be previously familiar with them. Next slide, please. These included a complete PDF of the introduction text, notes, and reading lists. And that you see one of those PDFs here. This is for the African-American Picture Gallery, which appeared in the Anglo-African magazine in 1859. These introductions were meant to be a simple PDF that could be saved, printed, deposited into a course learning management system, and readily made available to accompany other kinds of texts. And so kind of removing this from the anthology format allowed for these texts broader circulation and uses. Next slide, please. The site also includes some mechanisms for user engagement meant to highlight the way these editions have been used and taught in classrooms. And so these encourage further continued engagement from those who have come to adopt these texts in our classes. The conveners solicited contributions to be included on the site to the benefit of future instructors. And these included things like teaching reflections on the texts. Here you see Michael Stancliff's reflection on teaching Harper's poetry collection from around early 1840s, Forest Leaves, and some lesson plans on the right from Cassandra Smith for teaching Teresa. And I come to this work as someone who had participated in this project first as a user and then as a contributor. And so writing teaching reflections for texts like Teresa and Harper's Forest Leaves before working on additions helped, I think, to convey the usefulness of this project to me. And the value I find in this work is primarily as someone whose teaching has benefited from the availability of this text. And in that way, I think I'm not exceptional, but representative among the conveners. Our teaching and research are closely related, and the availability of these encouraged our continued thoughts about them and has influenced many folks' research in the ensuing years. And so this is to say that while this is framed primarily as a pedagogical project, the kind of inextricability from the archival work of recovery, this project is also positioned in a way that I think has created some shifts in our current research field as well. And so I want to just pause now to say a little bit about the current state of this project. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more in the Q&A about things like the difficulties of taking on a project as junior scholars, mostly from its original creators, and also thinking about the kind of transitional moment in which we're in. And right now we see ourselves as kind of in a pivotal position in which the migration of Just Teach One early African American print from its original home in the Commonplace website to the American Antiquarian Society's website, and also the changing circumstances of the project's current conveners allows us a moment to pause and take stock of what we're doing, what we have done, and what we might do in the future. We're especially grateful for the American Antiquarian Society's contributed support of this work. And we're now in a collective position, I think, to begin to make this project our own and to think more broadly about the kinds of work that we might do here. Searching for additional financial and material support for our work is going to be key as we imagine what this project is going to become in future years. And we've begun to discuss some of the more immediate and less resource intensive additions that we hope to make, as well as some possibilities for larger scale future plans. Some of these were discussed before the pandemic, but put on hold because of these circumstances. And others are part of more recent and ongoing conversations about where we might take Just Teach One early African American print. And I'll take the next slide. Thank you. And so now I just want to talk a little bit about some of the future possibilities that we've been envisioning, some examples of what we imagine for our next steps for the project in both the short and long term, which constitute both new textual additions and supplemental materials to accompany our existing texts that I think will change the orientation of the project a little bit. And these include some of the bulleted things here. Audio files of speeches or other oral works is something we've been talking about for a bit. We have plans to begin with some of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's speeches, the production of which is meant to coincide with the Dickens Universe's reading of Harper's last novel, Iola Leroy, which will take place in the summer of 22, that will accompany some introduction to Harper's larger body of work to a community of people who are not as familiar with her as scholars of early African American literature might be. And so thinking about producing some short audio files of speeches will lend themselves to thinking more carefully about the oral and the oral when we take on particular forms of writing. So extending this a bit beyond text. We're also exploring the usefulness of audio files for some other things that have been proposed to us, which include things like hymn books and sermons, to think a little bit more carefully beyond the text base. We've thought about virtual events to discuss pedagogical strategies and approaches to texts, facilitated by increased familiarity with virtual events and the technology to produce them that have ensued since 2020, and considering videos that would be made available afterward to facilitate conversations similar to the conference roundtable discussion format, but thinking again these for a kind of extended audience and in forms of preservation that might benefit our users beyond the individual oriented reflections on these pieces to include something more like conversations about them. We've also considered including plans for briefer blog post style introductions to accompany each of these works. And we imagine these to be suitable for more general audiences, even beyond academia. These introductions wouldn't replace the lengthier existing academic introductions to these texts, but we think they could serve to preface them for different kinds of audiences beyond the college classroom. And this speaks to our interests in presenting these texts simultaneously to multiple audiences rather than focusing on a kind of single academic audience, much in the way that our teaching reflections and lesson plans have tried to think about different contexts for teaching these classes. This has led us to also think about the creation of resources to make these texts accessible for teaching in a high school setting rather than just a college setting. And these could include lesson plans and activities suitable for various learning levels. We're currently exploring the possibility of an introductory version of a text project that would serve as a kind of test for this kind of thing, that would include some elements of a high school curriculum to accompany the recovered text, making this freely available to school districts and expanding the scope of who these texts might be for and what classrooms they might be able to be introduced in, as we see these things as not the propriety venue of just the college university classroom, but texts that really have the potential to be introduced in different settings. We've also considered something like larger scale projects that could introduce longer texts. The original version of the project included texts of about 30 pages long, but with additional resources, we've thought about including longer texts or even series of connected texts that might be linked and in this system. And we've also been considering additional more general resources to accompany this work around recovered texts. These additions speak to our interest in thinking about the project in terms of multiple audiences, expanding our scope, in which college and university courses would be only one of these avenues for inquiry of the recovered. It also speaks to our interests in collaborating across fields to expand our research and thinking about where these texts could be taught, both also in terms of university collaborations across different departmental collaborations that we haven't really thought about before, that could ask us to think a little bit about what and whose work with which these kinds of texts might intersect. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to just kind of present this pivotal moment of thinking about the future for this project, and the opportunity to learn from the people who are presenting here today as we consider to think about these possibilities. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Bridget. And our final panelist is Elizabeth Pope.
Hello all, I'm gonna keep this short so that we can have a chance to have some conversation amongst ourselves. Y'all can hear me, right? Okay. Black Self-Publishing is a collaborative research project based at the American Antiquarian Society, or AAS, which is a learned society and research library for the study of early American history in Worcester, Massachusetts. At its core, the Black Self-Publishing project is based around a list of books that were or may have been self-published, that were written by people of African descent living in the US in the long 19th century. And you can read more about the specific qualifiers on the website. I'm gonna actually send that link now in the chat if you wanna check that out. So I'll breeze through these quickly. If we can go to the next slide, please. So since this is a collaborative research project, it's celebrating the work of many people. There's a prototype site that was created in Omeka by an intern, Sadie Van Vranken. The list was developed, the list that this site is based on was developed in concert with a number of scholars. It builds on the work of Black bibliographers for hundreds of years, including Dorothy Porter Wesley, who Curtis already mentioned, and Daniel Murray, for instance, at the Library of Congress. And if you can fast forward to the next one, please. So what we have up now is basically the Omeka site based on what was essentially a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, but it is now presented online, and we've been adding additional content to that basic list. So what we have now are just these stubs that give ideas of, here are books that we think were self-published, as in financed and paid for by the author. So these are books we think are self-published, but we'd love additional information, evidence about their printing and publishing history. Eventually, we want to be including a lot more material, including transcripts, hopefully maybe digital editions, images. You can go to the next slide, please. So here's an example, also a little small, but just to give you an idea of the type of information we have in a basic one of these entry stubs. You basically have the title, the edition information, our catalog record to our copy at the Antiquarian Society if we have one. We've also included links to documenting the American South as well, and we hope to add many more links in the coming times. You can go to the next entry. So what we're really, the dream of this project is to find specific evidence of the printing and publishing history of works that were printed by or published by Black authors. And one of the working theories is there might be some difference in how that self-publishing may have offered an opportunity for Black authors who were being discriminated against in the printing process by the white publishers, that they might be more likely to self-publish. And we have some evidence. Here's a great example of exactly who they might have gone to do the actual printing work, how much it cost, how many copies were sold. This is an example from the Reverend Offley's narrative that gives the actual receipt for publishing that. So this was a great instance, but we've also found, if you can go to the next slide, please, as we've started to analyze the data that we've pulled together, we've found really interesting patterns. So for instance, there are often publishing firms, essentially started family firms publishing some of these works. So the wives of authors, so William Wells Brown, some of his works were published by his wife, Anna Elizabeth Gray Brown was listed as the publisher. And for others, Pascal Randolph, his wife, Mary Jane Randolph, was listed as the publisher of some of his works as well. So there's an interesting intersection here in, again, these family publishing, not empires, but there's something interesting going on here that we'd love to do some more work on and more studying of. We'd also love, as I mentioned, to include the digital editions, include newspapers and other forms besides books. We would love to be able to provide better bibliographic description and information, including information about the bindings. That's a question we get a lot from scholars who are working with the materials. Was this just issued in a wrapper, or did it have a complete binding? And we'd love to be able to partner more with other projects, such as the Black Bibliography Project, led by Jacqueline Goldsberry and Meredith McGill, and the Black Books Interactive Project with Dr. Miriam McGram. They've been doing really fabulous work with a scholar program where they are trying to connect people who are working on projects like these, working with Black books and digital Black projects in general. And so we'd love to be a part of that story, maybe working more with the Just Teach One projects that you just heard about from Bridget as well. So another area to reach out into would be the general public. And that's an area that the Colored Conventions Project and all of the work that they're doing at Dig Black has been just phenomenal at. So I'd love to be able to let us have a conversation. We had come up with some questions to jumpstart things, but since we're running so late, maybe we should start with questions from all of you. So I will stop talking.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. If all of our panelists would like to turn on their video and audio. There we go. As we noted, the Q&A is open, so folks are able to submit their questions there, and we will get to those in just a minute. As we await for those questions to arrive, there are a few questions, like we had said, like Elizabeth had said a moment ago, that we had kind of pre-prepared rather than have some sort of wrap up. I think one of the common themes of all of these presentations is that our work isn't done. We're in a pivotal moment. We are in a moment of transition. These are all very optimistic, very positive uh, works that are happening, and I'm incredibly grateful not just to the ADE, but also to all of the panelists here today. It's been an absolute joy to get to know you in the process. As these questions begin to arrive, I kind of wanted to start with the beginning of each of these projects. I will kind of address individuals in the questions, but other folks, of course, are able to kind of jump in and respond as well. One of the issues that frequently we wrestle with in taking on projects like this is that these sorts of digital projects are not our full-time jobs. I'm actually maybe beginning with Shirley here. Do you have any advice for those working on their own projects or thinking about starting a new project, digital or otherwise like this, from the dimension that such works are often situated as secondary or in many cases adjacent, or in some cases completely unrelated to the full-time positions that we hold?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. That's a really important question. And I just finished a session with my writing group in which we were talking about thinking about our careers as a book with many chapters, and I think that analogy can apply here in terms of thinking about when and how one wants to situate their work on digital projects, and thinking about, if your career is a book with many chapters, where are you at right now? And what parts of the chapter are you writing? And so for me, I think I also thought a lot about scale. So it was important for me early on to have a project that was really closely connected and kind of grew out of my quote unquote research. So they were closely aligned, they complemented each other really well. And I thought about scale. I had something that was contained, how can I get a small grant to support this piece of the work? And that gave me a kind of entry into the work. And I had imagined, and I had so much help from people in the Black DH community, because I had imagined in the DH community something much, much bigger, and everybody kept helping me think about, like, okay, let's take one piece of that project and let's work on that. If you want to create a partnership to digitize the papers, let's work on that piece, as opposed to like, I want to do that and all of these other things. And so I think that was really helpful, just thinking about how closely it could be related. I think also, thinking about, certain projects, I think with Bridget talking about just teach one, there's ways in which one can also link into projects that are already existing, so that they are not thinking about building an entire infrastructure for a project on their own. And so that can also be, what are the natural collaborations and the natural points of overlap, so that one's not the projects that require kind of, for me anyway, large scale infrastructure building and creating huge teams and getting big grants. Those for me come a little bit later, once I've established certain things institutionally. So I think just being really cognizant about where it fits into one's research, being intentional about it. Some people may choose that that's the path they want to take, institutional structures and, paths be damned. And that's fine as long as one's intentional about that. But thinking really, I guess, intentionally about how one can find something that has the right scale, if it connects with the research and where they're at that time, or if there's already projects that they can link into and be a part of, as opposed to, trying to build something from scratch.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Well, Shirley, you mentioned in the middle of that response, funding being an issue and going out and searching for grants and applying for those. One of the questions that came in from our attendees as well is about how we make sure that the projects we begin are in fact sustainable, and they're in fact feasible and doable. Funding is always a major challenge with these sorts of projects. Maybe I'll start with Kristen on this and just ask, could you briefly describe some of the ways in which your project has been supported, some of the challenges that might be down the road? Essentially, how do you, make sure that that sort of project is in fact sustainable?
Sure, I'd be happy to, but I would also say, I'm just so lucky to be working as part of a team. So I have had so much support in terms of having grantsmanship modeled, having senior colleagues review my grant applications, but also because I'm a junior scholar, my institution offered me certain kinds of seed funding that I think made the early parts of this research a little bit more doable. So, and that really acted as a bridge for me as I began to look for more substantial forms of funding, right? So I think that one of my, my big goals is to make sure that I'm able to hire Canadian graduate students to take part in Dig Black, and to really be exposed to those sorts of those research methodologies. And I've been able to do that through both smaller institutional grants and also through bigger national grants like SSHRC. Right, so SSHRC has been, I'm very excited about the Mary Ann Chud Carey project, and that has been a turning point. And I think that for me, that will enable sort of a continued pipeline of Canadian graduate students to participate in the project, but also hopefully to be exposed to these kinds of methodologies and bring that back to their own research.
Great. Elizabeth, anything to add on
Sure.
funding challenges?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So the initial stages of this project, it's very much in still the initial phases, but we had an internship available, and that really helped to get some of the work done. But that's something that we're actively looking at. And one of the other things I would just say, related but not exactly, is reaching out to other projects, going to events, going to conferences, talking to people about what you're working on, and seeing if it might connect to work that they're doing as something you could do together as a group, perhaps. That these are all ways that we are thinking about in trying to move forward to next steps, is to find other people to partner with. And that's the whole point of this conversation, is about how do you do that collaboration. So for me, it's been trying to get to know people who are already doing this work. And is there a way I can help? Can I support your work? Can we work together on something? And trying to bring in new people to that conversation is also part of that, what we're hoping to do.
And Bridget, further thoughts on funding or sustainability?
I mean, I can talk a little bit to the structural challenges, I think, of this work for the people involved in the Just Teach One Early African American Print Project. Our current team of conveners is now comprised mostly of scholars who are either untenured or very recently tenured. And the various conditions of our work institutions has made it difficult to attend to this projects, as many of us have wanted to, even in pre-pandemic times. Many of us have had to prioritize the work that would be valued by our institutions as we've gone up for tenure, and ensured that we would be able to continue this kind of work, because we know that this kind of work would not be counted by our institutions as valuable. And this is particularly true, I think, of work in African American studies. Work in early African American studies has an interesting position because it is attended by myths of its absence and erasure. So the idea that Black people did not read or produce anything before the Harlem Renaissance, I think, is something that we are still continuing to contend with, sometimes in institutions in which there aren't necessarily other people who value or understand that this kind of work exists. And this is, I think, a larger structural problem that would be nice to address institutionally as we think about what kinds of work are valued, what kinds of work are important, and what kinds of work are supported. And I think there's a kind of particular danger of this kind of work being just kind of supported without the necessity of finding outside institutional support. And so the conversations that we've been having most recently, while they've had to do with kind of our individual circumstances of moving institutions, dealing with department closures, these kinds of challenges, are also to the need to turn outside of our own institutions to think about support, because in some places, the kind of support to do this kind of work has been denied us kind of explicitly. And so this has kind of expanded our thinking about what we would need to be able to do this. What might we be able to pull collectively in order to do this kind of work? Who might we partner with who does have institutional support in ways that we don't, in order to be able to do the kind of work that we want to do? And so we've been thinking a little bit more strategically, I think, most recently than we had at the outset, because we've kind of started to see the confluence of these in terms of not only what we were able to do, but in terms of what we were able to imagine for the project.
Great, thank you. Yeah. One of the questions that I've often kind of grappled with these sorts of projects prior to my coming in to AAS here has really been about thinking about what counts within an institution, what counts for support, what counts for promotion and tenure committees. One of the things that we've often kind of grappled with, or I've often grappled with in those sorts of committees, is the degree to which peer review plays in that specific digital project. Curtis, could you talk a little bit more about the role that peer review plays in your project, how you've kind of created or maintained those sorts of protocols, what you're looking for in terms of evaluation or self-assessment, et cetera?
Hi, yes. For me personally, I guess I won't get into my issue as a librarian is to get promotion. We don't have tenure where I work. We have a tenure equivalent. You're on a time clock, it's up or out. And it wasn't easy for me to leverage my work, especially, with colored conventions into some of the different areas that I was being assessed, along with the other parts of my job. However, I did have some discussions with other people in the project. For example, Lauren Cooper, who's the project director of the Color Conventions project. I don't know what her status and title is. Maybe Shirley can tell me in terms of Dig Black overall, but she is on a tenure track at Penn State. And part of what I guess I would say overall is that the model that is used for digital projects and thinking about digital projects and the kind of research that goes into Color Conventions and Dig Black is that the digital tools, the website, which was recently redesigned, for example, our new website, they're working on a solar search plugin tool for the Omeka part of our site. And I can explain that if people, we're sort of two sites. One runs on WordPress and one for our digital items runs on Omeka. But the output of the digital products is a type of publishing that can be subject to peer review and should be. And I know that Lauren is building her dossier of work in this way. And the website itself recently has been the subject of a peer review in the Journal of American History, our redesigned website. I'll put the link there. But while things might not technically fall into peer review, the process of research, learning, the types of partnerships that Elizabeth was talking about is how products and tools aspects of the site are developed, starting with literature searches, for example, Omeka forums, WordPress forums, reaching out to colleagues at other institutions for the testing part, for example. The site and its components are conceived as publishing and as bits of research, pieces of research that are subject to peer review.
Other takers? Want to move on? One of the questions, oh, sorry, Curtis. No.
I was just going to say, this may be a little unorthodox, but I noticed we actually have one of the co-founders of the project is in attendance. I saw Jim Casey's name. So if Jim cares to chime in here as one of the co-founders, to add to what I say or expand on it, I would invite him to do so. I hope everybody else will be okay with that. That's all. The founders were, I just want to, repeat their names, Professor Gabrielle Foreman, Jim Casey, as well as Sarah Patterson, who is now at UMass Amherst, were the three co-founders back when the project was at UD and grew out of this graduate course that Jim and Sarah were students in and that Gabrielle was teaching.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm not sure if I'm coming through. Curtis, I'm not sure what to say thanks or something else for putting me on the spot. I'm going to hear some smart people talk this afternoon. But to that end, I was actually just in the process of typing out a question, which is that when we first began doing this work all those many years ago, we didn't have a lot of sort of immediate examples or fellow travelers or sort of close cousins in terms of projects. And maybe that's starting to change. And I'd love to hear if folks on the panel have any sort of thoughts about the larger landscape in this moment. I don't, even in stark terms, I'm not sure if I can remember a panel on Black scholarly digital editing that I've had the pleasure to get and sit and listen to before. So obviously there are lots of challenges that we all, I think, share in this moment. But I'd be curious if folks also have thoughts sort of about the opportunities with the sort of converging tides in this moment. And I'll take my question off the air.
Any takers? Elizabeth, go ahead.
I was going to say, maybe Shirley, you could close us off on this since you're part of a project that is coordinating and pulling together some of these early projects. I know we've all mentioned a few that we found really motivating or helpful, but I think we're running down on time. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think there's just a lot of really exciting work happening right now. And I think one of the things that, it's been great to be part of this session. And, Elizabeth, you had mentioned one of the pieces of advice is like getting in conversation, going to sessions, listening to people, making the connections, learning from each other. Right now, as we're going through the session, I'm thinking about Bridget talking about Just Teach One and the model of having the conveners and that having being able to have an entire new set of conveners leading the project. And that is phenomenal to me to be able to see a kind of leadership model or a organizational model in that way. And so I think that's really exciting. I think thinking about how just having this opportunity, as Jim is mentioning, to think about and really being invited to call into question, what does it mean to do digital editing? What does it mean to have a quote unquote scholarly edition? I think Bridget's commenting on that in the Q&A as well, in terms of how these projects are valued within traditional academic spaces, but having a space where we can really start to rethink those questions and being able to call on the figures, the materials that we're working with to guide our responses to those questions. You know, how do the texts that we're working with push us to call for different models for what digital editing is and could be? You know, one of the challenges I have is I'm working with, kind of to Kristen's point, working with archives that are, you know, still in people's houses and having to recover them. I'm working with archives and what I'm calling shadow books, you know, and books that are either privately printed, books that are never written, books that are written and now lost. And what apparatus do we have to talk about, you know, to frame that kind, you know, those kinds of projects out? But that's so important because the racial and gendered mechanisms of print made it so that these different kinds of spaces become really important. And so what kinds of traces do they leave? How do we deal with them? How do we call into question what this project is, who it's for, how we involve, you know, as many audiences and different audiences in this project as possible? So I guess I would just say that and say thank you for convening this session and giving us a chance to talk together and to grapple with these questions together.
I think we might have time for one last question. I'd like to kind of throw it out to anyone who would take it on our panel. And this comes from one of the attendees, but I'm also going to combine a couple here. So this first question is really about public humanities. This is a question for all of us. Would anybody like to talk about the ways in which our projects engage in the public humanities, whether it's K through 12 audiences or other general publics? And then also attached to that, thinking about who we're creating for and who we're creating with. Some of us have talked about the roles of students in some of these projects. So would somebody like to talk about the importance that both undergraduate and graduate students play in the creation of these projects?
I'd like to jump in really quickly because I think that for me, one of the most exciting things about seeing the partnership between the Robbins family and Archives Ontario take place was really the ability to think about how their own positionality, right, as Black Canadians, as retired educators, can potentially inform how those papers are being used and accessed. And so during our conversations, we really tried to center how Black students could be central, right, to the even the cataloging of the papers in really practical sense, could be invited into Archives Ontario to kind of get their hands dirty and to be getting new kinds of exposure, right, to archival practices. That was really exciting, right? It's something that both represented them and their interests, I think, but also the goals of the Colored Conventions Project and the Center for Black Digital Research. So that felt like a really good synergy.
Great. Anyone else? Curtis?
I know we're almost out of time. I'll say quickly, students, undergraduate students and graduate students are full contributors, thinkers, and they become experts, you know, in their time working with Colored Conventions and with Dig Black. One of the key creators for our web content and our coders is an undergraduate student, for example, Michelle. And one of the problems to touch on what Jim was talking about not seeing models, and it's the issue of sort of needing sometimes to break the rules in the way that things are done in the sort of web world and the IT world, how some of those practices, and I got this from talking to other team members, such as the core people building the site, they needed to intervene in order to do things a different way in order to counteract the kind of erasure I was talking about. And I don't think maybe it's changing, but I'm not sure a lot of projects have a fruitful conversation between the sort of the tech people who may not be thinking about these issues and the content creators who foreground those issues. The Colored Conventions has brought people who do both together to talk and create.
Great. Thank you very much, Curtis. I'm sorry to say that we are actually out of time now. So I would like to actually turn to Noelle Baker, President of the ADE, for her final thoughts and wrap up. Noelle,
Thank
are
you.
you there?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. So as he mentioned, as program committee chair and the incoming president of the Association for Documentary Editing, I would like to extend my thank you for all who have presented and all those who have attended representation and recovery in June and July. I mean, this session was amazing, and so were the ones that preceded it. I'm grateful for the presentations, and I appreciate Dickinson State University's team of technicians who have supported these exciting conversations. With appreciation, then, this does conclude the 2021 conference of the Association for Documentary Editing.